Miles above the ocean, disaster strikes as a Qantas Airbus A330 on its way from Singapore to Perth dips into a terrifying dive. Passengers are thrown into the ceiling and badly injured, while the pilots are hanging on for dear life. Nobody knows what is causing the plane's violent behaviour, or if it will stop before they hit the ocean below. This is an incredible tale where science fiction meets horror, and I've invited the captain himself to tell the story.
Now, I'm starting to think, wow, is my life going to end today?
This is the story of Qantas Flight 72. On the morning of October 7th, 2008, 303 passengers and 12 crew stepped aboard Qantas Flight 72 at Singapore's Changi Airport. They were bound for Perth, on the west coast of Australia, a 5-hour journey. The weather on this day was perfect for flying. Clear skies, light winds, and, to top it all off, there was very little air traffic around Singapore. If there was such a thing as an easy day for flying, this was surely it. But up in the front of the massive Airbus A330, the pilots were already joking about the captain's purported record for attracting bad luck. That captain was 53-year-old Kevin Sullivan.
You know, I've had an engine blow up on me, I've had fumes events, I've had jet upsets, I've had a lot of things, and this was my reputation as the shit magnet.
Despite his reputation for courting emergencies and malfunctions, Sullivan was an outstanding pilot. He had started his career in the US Navy and had gone on to become a Top Gun pilot, making him part of a small group of some of the most elite fighter pilots in the world. He joined Qantas in 1986, where he flew the Boeing 747 and 767. By this point, he'd been a captain on the Airbus A330 for 4 years. Sitting to his right was an equally competent first officer, Pete Lipsett. Like the captain, Lipsett had gotten his start with the military, in his case, the Royal Australian Navy. There, he had been a helicopter pilot carrying out everything from search and rescue missions to anti-submarine warfare and United Nations operations in the Middle East. He had joined Qantas 12 years previously, in 1996, where he built up his experience on the Boeing 747, 737, and now on the Airbus A330. Due to the combined length of the flight over to Perth and back, there was a third flight crew member on board. Second Officer Ross Hales was the youngest of the three pilots and had just over 2,000 hours total flying time. Most of this was built up flying smaller propeller aircraft in Western Australia and the Northern Territory. He would be taking over from the captain and then the first officer during the cruise, so that they could each get some rest. The aircraft was buzzing with activity as the pilots programmed their route to Perth into the flight management computer and set up the aircraft for departure. This was only the crew's second time flying together. The first time was their flight into Singapore from Brisbane the previous day. They had bonded over some beer and satay that evening, and now, on the flight deck of their A330, this newly formed team was about to be put to the ultimate test. At 25 minutes past 9 that morning, Flight 72 pushed back from the gate at Singapore, loaded with fuel and 303 passengers. Not a single seat on board the plane was empty. The pilots started the engines and began their taxi out to the runway. In 4 hours and 45 minutes, they would be in Perth. Singapore's airport was uncharacteristically quiet on this morning, and the pilots had reached the departure runway in just 8 minutes. Captain Sullivan lined the plane up and pushed the A330's engines to take off thrust. Moments later, the plane was airborne and climbing serenely out over the Straits of Malacca. The captain was flying the aircraft manually, something that long-haul pilots don't do all that often. He had no idea that later this morning, his long-standing belief in the value of hands-on flying would be vindicated in the most shocking and dramatic way imaginable. In the back of the plane, the passengers settled in for the journey. They were treated to some stunning views of the waterways beneath the aircraft as it climbed out. Suddenly, in the cockpit, the master caution light illuminated. The flight had barely left Singapore, and already it appeared that Captain Sullivan's reputation for attracting trouble was rearing its head. Sullivan turned on the autopilot to free up his attention so he could figure out what was going wrong. Meanwhile, First Officer Lipsett cancelled the warning as per Airbus procedure, so that it didn't distract the pilots while they were working through the problem. the two men drew their attention to the fault message appearing on their central display, known as the ECAM, or Electronic Centralized Aircraft Monitor. The message read, "Air, engine bleed 1 fault." Unlike what the name might suggest, the engine was not bleeding. Rather, this message meant that there was a problem with the system that siphons off air from the engine and feeds it into the cabin to pressurize it. The A330 is a highly sophisticated aircraft, and when something like this goes wrong, the computers do more than just tell the pilots what the problem is. They display on screen the steps required to fix it. One by one, the first officer carried out these steps, while the captain kept an eye on the plane's flight path. This splitting of duties is a huge part of what makes flying so safe today, and it would prove to be even more important as the flight progressed. As the first officer worked through these steps, known as ECAM actions, the captain spotted some thunderstorms ahead. He turned the plane off course to avoid them. Within a few minutes, the first officer had rectified the issue with the bleed air, and the captain had brought the plane into clear skies. Once again, all was well on board Flight 72. In the cabin, the passengers never even knew that anything had happened. This calm, methodical approach to routine problems like this had characterized these pilots' entire careers. It's the reason that Qantas has long enjoyed the title of the world's safest airline. But this is not where the story of Flight 72 ends. In fact, it's now only just begun. 30 minutes after departure, Flight 72 was cruising high above the Indian Ocean at 37,000 feet. There was a holiday atmosphere on board, with passengers moving about the cabin, flight attendants preparing meals, and light chatter filling the air. At this point, now 90 minutes into his duty time, the captain got up from his seat and headed back outside the cockpit to his rest bunk. Here, he would stay for a little over an hour, while in his place sat Second Officer Ross Hales. The purpose of this crew change was so that the captain and first officer could be fully rested and alert for the most important parts of the flight, namely takeoff and landing.
3 are on duty for takeoff, 3 are on duty for landing. So you do have, in the critical phases of flight, you have 3 sets of eyes on duty, 3 sets of brains working together for the critical phases of flight of takeoff and landing.
For the next hour or so, the flight progressed as normal, cruising south over the vast Indian Ocean. Meals were handed out and drinks served, and the light-hearted atmosphere on board continued. After a little over an hour, Captain Sullivan's rest time was over. He re-entered the cockpit, which was now brightly lit from the cloudless sky all around it. He swapped out with Second Officer Hales, and once again sat at the helm of the aircraft. It was 12:35 p.m. Perth time. The red shoreline of Australia's northern coast was now clearly coming into view on the horizon. First Officer Lipset then took his break, heading back to his bunk outside the cockpit. He would be returning to the flight deck just before the plane began its descent into Perth. Hales settled into his seat, and once again there were 2 pilots at the controls. Suddenly, the autopilot disconnected. The captain grabbed his side stick and began flying the plane manually. In the right-hand seat, Second Officer Hales cancelled the aural alert tone, while the captain engaged the second autopilot. A dizzying array of fault messages had appeared on the ECAM, but none of the primary instruments hinted at the nature of the problem. Then, suddenly, the stall warning sounded. This is one of the most urgent warnings a pilot can hear. It indicates that the plane is flying too slow, and that the wings can no longer support the plane's weight in the air. According to the computers, Flight 72 was about to start falling towards the ocean. The pilots were perplexed. They hadn't changed anything with the plane, and all of a sudden, it was telling them that they were about to fall out of the sky. How could this be happening? Then, the captain noticed something even more troubling. Emblazoned on his primary flight display was a red overspeed warning. This was impossible. His aircraft was telling him that he was flying both too fast and too slow. Each of these were extremely serious warnings, but they couldn't both be true. The question was, were either of them true? The pilots needed to check their speed. The captain looked at the speed tape on his primary flight display, but the readings were all over the place. It was as if his flight computers had lost their minds. And what's more, his altitude readings were erratic too. This was truly bizarre. Altitude and speed information are the most critical things a pilot needs to know to control a plane. Captain Sullivan knew that he was dealing with a problem which had been termed unreliable airspeed by Airbus. This is not a diagnosis the computers can make themselves, given that they are the ones at fault to begin with in this scenario. It's up to the pilots to figure out that this is going on, and to take the appropriate steps to resolve it. The captain glanced over at the standby instruments, which are there in case of exactly this kind of scenario. The readings they were giving seemed much more plausible. He cross-checked these against the second officer's instruments, which were showing the same readings. At least he knew that these two instruments were accurate. It would be inconvenient, but he would be able to fly just by using the standby instruments and the second officer's instruments. But very quickly, the captain could see that this situation wasn't the normal unreliable speed scenario that he had practiced many times in the simulator. His navigation display had now gone blank. Whatever was happening to the plane was much deeper than a faulty airspeed indicator. Captain Sullivan told Hales to call the first officer back to the cockpit. The crew would need all the brainpower and experience they could get to figure out what was going wrong. In the cabin, the passengers and flight attendants were oblivious to the rising confusion on the flight deck. None of the warnings blaring in the cockpit were audible back there, and the aircraft was still flying perfectly normally. The meal service had just finished, and some of the flight attendants had taken to their bunks to rest before the descent into Perth. But the problems which had started in the cockpit were soon about to wreak havoc on the rest of the plane. Captain Sullivan disconnected the autopilot. Without basic information like speed and altitude, he didn't trust the autopilot to control the plane safely. With his left hand on the side stick and his right hand on the thrust levers, he kept the plane flying at 37,000 feet.
It's not designed to be flown manually up there. You can. You just have to be careful. It's very, very minute corrections, but it's very twitchy up there.
He was using the standby instruments and the first officer's displays to manage his speed and altitude, something he likened to driving from the passenger's seat. No matter how often the first officer tried to silence the alarms, they kept blaring. The atmosphere inside the cockpit was stressful and confusing. The pilot's training for emergencies was extensive, but they had never encountered or even heard of a situation like this. They were now truly in uncharted territory.
So now we're left in the dark, and we're in no man's land of automation failure because we can't interact, the plane's not communicating with us. What's it going to do next?
The pilots were confused, but the plane's computers were even more confused. Even though there was nothing wrong with the plane physically, the computers believed it was in extreme danger. Thankfully, it was daytime outside, and the pilots could clearly see that the aircraft was flying safely. Other crews who experienced similar issues over the years were not so lucky. But Flight 72's luck was now about to run out. Suddenly, the nose of the plane dipped slightly. The first officer, who was in the forward galley, felt a strange vibration through the floor and heard the engine power decrease. The captain grabbed the controls tightly.
As soon as I felt that, I put my hand on the stick. Didn't move it, just had it there because it wasn't turbulence, it wasn't anything I had done, but the tail had just dipped a little bit.
Then, all of a sudden, the aircraft violently pitched down. The captain was nearly lifted out of his seat, restrained only by his lap belt. Both pilots braced themselves against the glare shield as the plane lurched down. Heavy manuals and charts beside the second officer began to float up around him as the plane entered zero gravity. He swatted them away towards the back of the cockpit. Captain Sullivan was pulling fully back on his side stick, desperately trying to pull the plane out of its dive. But the plane wasn't responding.
We're going down, I'm pulling back, nothing's happening. Now I go, well, we're in trouble.
In the cabin, passengers and flight attendants who were not strapped in were flung to the ceiling, their heads smashing through the plastic paneling. Passengers screamed as they were pinned to the ceiling, along with luggage and meal trays. The terrifying sight of the blue Indian Ocean filled the pilot's windscreens. The captain was helpless to stop the dive. If this continued, he and his 314 passengers and crew would soon be dead. Faced with this terror, Sullivan desperately searched his mind for a way out. He had to wrestle back control of the plane somehow. He had a flashback to his days flying fighter jets, and an old trick occurred to him. He did the most counterintuitive thing possible and neutralized the controls. But this did nothing. The plane was still on a collision course with the ocean. Trying intensely to overcome the adrenaline coursing through his body, the captain began making small movements on the side stick, trying to coax the nose up. And finally, it worked. The nose started to rise. The computers which had locked him out were now letting him back in. But Captain Sullivan knew that behind him, passengers were still pinned to the ceiling from the G-forces. If he pulled up too quickly, they would come crashing back down to the floor. He carefully pulled back on his side stick, slowly raising the nose. The plane had dropped almost 700 feet in just a few seconds, but when it started to level out, the passengers were slammed back to the floor. Gingerly, the captain started to climb his crippled aircraft back to 37,000 feet. Both pilots were stunned. Second Officer Hales asked what the hell had just happened. The captain knew that there was only one possible culprit: the PRIM. PRIM is the name Airbus gives to the primary flight control computer. These are the computers that mediate between the pilot's inputs on the controls and the control surfaces themselves, on the wings and the tail.
On an Airbus, there are no mechanical connections between the pilot's control stick and the control surfaces. Who's moving those control surfaces? It's the flight control computer. That's the PRIM.
For some reason, one of these computers had decided to send signals to the tail of the plane without any input from the pilots. They had also decided to ignore the captain's commands to stop the tail from moving. The PRIM had developed a mind of its own, and it appeared to be determined to send the plane into the ocean. Why the plane's computers would do this was a complete mystery, and, worryingly, this meant that there was no telling whether it would happen again. Rattled, the captain temporarily handed over control to the second officer so that he could put on his shoulder harnesses. It was beginning to look like he would need them. In the passenger cabin, it looked as if a bomb had gone off. Luggage, meal trays, and people were strewn everywhere. Bottles of red wine had smashed, their contents pouring out over the cabin like pools of blood. Some passengers had been seriously injured, with broken limbs, while others had been knocked unconscious by their violent collision with the roof of the plane. Throughout the cabin, people were screaming and moaning. In the front galley, First Officer Pete Lipstead had hit the floor hard when the plane pulled out of its dive. He was hurt, but still conscious.
If ejection seats were fitted for the passengers and the crew, it would have been fireworks. People would have just been ejecting themselves out of that plane because it was hell.
Captain Sullivan took control again once he had strapped himself fully in. Both pilots' bodies were surging with adrenaline after the life-threatening dive. They had tunnel vision and were intently scanning their instruments, looking for some clue as to what their deranged jet was doing. This electrified state of mind and body, known as the fight or flight response, may have been helpful tens of thousands of years ago in the ancestral environment, but in the cockpit of a modern passenger aircraft, it would only hinder the pilot's performance. They now needed to fight back against their own bodily reactions so that they could manage this deadly situation. 315 lives hung in the balance.
I got very angry, and I channeled that anger into action. I don't go crazy, I just use that energy for higher workload.
Captain Sullivan encouraged Hales to take some deep breaths. Both pilots took a few seconds to do this, and then Hales made a PA, telling the passengers to be seated immediately. The ECAM was lit up with amber fault messages. Maybe, the pilots hoped, they would be able to prevent a reoccurrence if they could just get through all of these alerts. Hales began dealing with them one by one, while the captain continued flying the plane. The pilot's workload was immense. Even on a good day, this would be a lot of issues to be dealing with. But without being able to use the autopilot to ease his workload, Captain Sullivan had to split his attention between flying the aircraft by hand at 37,000 feet and monitoring his colleague as he reconfigured the aircraft's countless crippled systems. At the same time, Hales had to split his attention between carrying out the ECAM actions and making sure the captain was flying the plane safely. And, amid all of this, the computerized warnings continued to blare. The cockpit was a hellscape. Loud, distracting, and confusing, with paper manuals strewn everywhere, and no indication as to what was actually happening. As the captain continued climbing back to cruise altitude, the second officer reached a critical point in one of the checklists. It involved resetting PRIM 3, one of the plane's primary flight control computers. To check that this was safe to do, the pilots would need to consult one of their paper manuals, but these were strewn all over the cockpit floor, as if to mirror the chaos in the aircraft's systems. The captain grabbed his version from beside him and handed it over to his colleague. Resetting the PRIM computers is a procedure that pilots had practiced before in the simulator. Now, they were about to see how closely reality matched their training. Second Officer Hales read the checklist out loud, including its various cautionary messages and caveats. And then, with a nod from the captain, he reached up, raised the guard which covered the switch, and reset it. Immediately, the stall warning stopped, and finally, there was peace in the cockpit. It was 12:45 PM Perth time, and the plane was now back at 37,000 feet. For the first time since the emergency began, some semblance of normality had returned. All the pilots needed now was for the first officer to return to the cockpit, so that they could all formulate a plan together. While they waited, the captain opened the flight control system page on the ECAM to see whether these systems were functioning normally. According to the computers, everything was in the green. Things were beginning to look up for Flight 72.
Stalled.
But suddenly, the stall warning sounded again. The passengers screamed as the engines spooled down just like they did before the last dive. And then it happened. The nose dipped for a second time. Sullivan pulled back fully on his side stick, but again the aircraft wouldn't listen. Both pilots were lifted up and pressed against their shoulder straps as the plane, travelling at 800 km per hour, began powering towards the ocean. For the second time, passengers were lifted out of their seats and propelled into the ceiling. Glasses smashed and bags and rubbish began floating in mid-air. The aircraft's deranged computers seemed hell-bent on driving everyone on board straight into the Indian Ocean. The first officer was still in the forward galley, holding on for dear life. He needed to get back into the cockpit to find out what was going on. Again, the captain released his grip on the controls, and then, gradually, began making small backward movements on the side stick. After an almost 400-foot drop, the plane started to respond. Gradually, Sullivan pulled the nose up. He was trying to be as delicate as possible. Any sudden movements, and he would seriously injure the unrestrained passengers. As the plane recovered, everyone in the passenger cabin who had been lifted up was once again thrown back to the floor. The cabin was now in even more disarray than it had been a few moments ago. This was a dizzying, disorientating, and terrifying roller coaster. Nobody on board knew what was happening. Up front, the two pilots were rattled.
The automation acted violently and erratically, and we couldn't interact. And that's the science fiction scenario. It's, iRobot. We were passengers, just like the people that had paid money to sit in the back.
The captain again encouraged the second officer to take deep breaths, holding them in for a few seconds to subdue their body's startle response. This was a fight to the death, and they had to be on their A-game. As Sullivan continued the climb back to 37,000 feet, he noticed that the trim wheel, which normally moves automatically to relieve him from constantly needing to pull back during a climb, wasn't moving. This was strange. The aircraft he was flying had now been reduced to a level of automation similar to the 1950s era planes he had been trained on, back when he had first learned how to fly. This aircraft was seriously sick, and what little automation was still working was trying to kill everyone on board. The captain moved the trim wheel back manually as he climbed back up to cruise altitude, making a mental note of how very degraded his aircraft had now become. The faults which had appeared on the ECAM the first time round now appeared again. It seemed that resetting the computers had achieved nothing. The stall and overspeed warnings continued to blare, and the pilots had now become sickened by the dreadful powerlessness of their predicament. As the first officer worked through the error messages again, he saw the most ominous one of all. PRIM 3, the flight control computer that had failed the first time, had failed again. The ECAM was telling the pilots to reset the system. The two men looked up at the switch, which is now displaying its fault light. They looked over at each other. The last time they pressed this button, the plane had gone berserk. The second officer had his finger ready to press the switch and asked the captain to confirm that he should press it. "No, don't f*** with it," said Sullivan. This was one switch which was better left where it was.
And it's like, no, don't reset it now. It's like, I gave that dog a bone and it bit me. Yeah. I'm not going to give that dog a bone anymore.
By this point, the captain decided that he needed to reassure the passengers that he and his fellow pilots were still alive, functional, and fighting against their deranged aircraft. Sullivan made a quick PA to this effect and told the passengers to stay strapped in. But just as the pilots thought that their situation couldn't get any worse, the alert chime sounded and the master caution light lit up. The pilots looked at the ECAM and saw an amber warning message, which then disappeared as soon as they caught a glimpse of it. Then another chime, and another alert which disappeared before their eyes. Then another, and another. Their plane was now having a complete meltdown. The pilots couldn't trust a thing their computers were telling them.
Like I was doing, looking at the instruments, like what's going on? The things that I could look at weren't giving me the answers I needed.
To cancel out all of the warnings, Second Officer Hales pressed the emergency cancel button on the forward pedestal. But nothing happened. He pressed it again, and again. But still, the warnings continued. This system too was computer controlled, and it was just as confused as the rest of the aircraft. The very systems which had been so meticulously designed to help the pilots had now become their worst enemy. The plane was still 2 hours from Perth at this point. Keeping it in the air for that long was a terrifying prospect. One more dive, and it might be their last. The pilots again called the first officer back to the cockpit. They desperately needed all the help they could get to manage their impossible situation. Within moments, the first officer burst into the cockpit after the captain granted him entry. He scrambled into his seat, swapping out with the dazed second officer Hales. Lipset told the other two pilots about the abysmal condition of the passenger cabin and said he thought that he had broken his nose, which was now turning red. But that problem could wait. With the two most experienced pilots now sitting at the controls of Flight 72, they needed to devote all of their attention to the task at hand. Captain Sullivan filled the first officer in on the situation, while alarms rang out in the background. He told him that the dives were computer generated, and that he couldn't stop them with his controls.
That's quite difficult, again, for him to come in, regardless of his experience, to sit down and now immediately be able to function. He can't, because he doesn't know what's happened. And basically, I said, the plane pitched down, I tried to stop it, and I couldn't. And, it's like, what?
Lipset suggested that they declare an emergency to air traffic control and divert to Learmonth, a military airfield about 150 kilometres from their current position. Sullivan agreed. The computers could send the plane into another dive at any moment. They needed to get on the ground as soon as possible. However, the captain disagreed with Lipset that they needed to declare a Mayday. He decided that they would declare a PAN instead. A PAN is the international signal that a flight has a serious issue, but that the plane and the lives of its occupants are not at immediate risk. A Mayday, on the other hand, tells the ground that there is a serious threat to life and that emergency assistance is required. The captain was not yet aware of the full extent of the injuries to the passengers. He needed more information before he could justify declaring a Mayday. First Officer Lipset called Melbourne Air Traffic Control and advised them that they were experiencing flight control problems, that passengers had been injured, and that they needed to divert to Learmonth. The controller cleared them down to 35,000 feet and gave them permission to go directly to Learmonth. All the other pilots on the same frequency immediately wondered what could be happening. flight control problems which were bad enough to injure passengers were a serious issue. Something big was unfolding out over the northwest tip of Australia. Captain Sullivan told the second officer to ask for an assessment of the injuries in the cabin. If they were bad enough, he would have cause to declare a Mayday, which would mobilise the full complement of emergency services. Meanwhile, he began turning the plane left towards Learmonth. This was an unfamiliar airport for the pilots. By chance, the captain had been there once before, for a day in 1981, when he was in the US Navy. But he hadn't landed there himself. This would be the first time that any of the flight crew had actually flown into the airport. They needed to find out what they could expect when they got there. How long was the runway? Which direction was it in? And what was the best way to approach it? Sullivan slowed the plane down to give the crew time to cobble together their approach charts and make a plan for their arrival. But at the same time, they would have to be fast. At any moment, the manic computers could strike again. A perfect balance had to be struck here. Spend too long preparing everything in the air, and the pilots would risk entering another death dive. But try and land too quickly, and the aircraft might throw some nasty surprises at them as they lowered the flaps and the gear. This was an unknown emergency, not covered in any of the manuals. The adrenaline in the cockpit was through the roof, but the pilots went about their duties professionally and methodically. This was the ultimate test of their skills, experience, and their ability to work under pressure. Flight 72 was now 80 kilometers from Learmonth, and the pilots began preparing a plan for their approach. As the first officer tried to put Learmonth into his flight management computer, he found that it wasn't responding to his key presses. This meant that he couldn't get the airport to appear on his navigation display, nor could he work out the speeds and altitudes for their approach to the airport. Not for the first time today, the pilots were thrown back decades to the bygone days of visual navigation. They would have to find the airport out their windscreens and navigate to it that way. It wasn't that this was particularly dangerous, but it dramatically increased their workload and stress levels at a time when they were already close to breaking point. In the passenger cabin, the flight attendants who weren't themselves badly hurt were rushing around to help the injured. One of these was off-duty flight attendant Diana Casey, who had been heroically tending to the injured passengers, all while her husband protected her 2 daughters. She answered the second officer's call on the interphone, and for the first time, the pilots got a report of the injuries on board. There were broken bones, lacerations, possible spinal injuries, and even passengers hanging half out of the ceiling after bursting through it during the last dive. Immediately, the pilots agreed that this called for a Mayday declaration. The first officer radioed air traffic control with their Mayday, saying that they had a significant number of serious injuries on board. This activated a nationwide alert, with emergency help coming in from far and wide to the remote airport of Learmonth. With their electronic charts not working, the pilots began looking for their paper charts, which were scattered across the cockpit floor. As the stall and overspeed alarms blared, they needed to locate the approach charts for Learmonth amid the hundreds of pages in their massive folders. As the first and second officer did this, a new problem emerged, which the pilots noticed when their ears started popping. Lipset checked the cabin pressurization, and sure enough, the automatic system for controlling the cabin pressure had now failed too. This meant that as the plane descended, the pilots would have to control the cabin pressure manually, constantly adjusting it so that the air stayed breathable. It was as if the automation was playing a deadly game of spinning plates, handing the pilots more and more plates until they all came crashing down. Second Officer Hales volunteered to control the cabin pressure, while the other pilots dealt with navigating the stricken aircraft to the airport and setting it up for landing. Amid the cacophony of confusing alarms, Captain Sullivan had to rely on the old flying principle of aviate, navigate, and communicate to prioritise his tasks. If he could keep this mantra running in his head, he would be able to stay on top of the most important items while preventing the less urgent tasks from distracting him. But in order to prioritise his tasks, he first had to know what the aircraft's problems even were. Sullivan and Lipset methodically stepped through the almost innumerable items appearing on the ECAM, making a note of each one. But with the state their plane was in, Was it possible that there were some problems that the computers weren't telling them about? The last thing the crew wanted was a nasty surprise on final approach. Lipset used the satellite phone to call the Qantas maintenance unit in Sydney. The A330, being a modern aircraft, constantly streams data to the airline's home base. If there were additional problems not being shown to the pilots, perhaps this maintenance unit could see them. As Lipset called Sydney, Second Officer Hales had found the charts for the airport. Now, he would be able to help his colleagues plan their approach. His assistance would be vital as the plane descended towards the airport. Learmonth had no air traffic control, which meant that the pilots basically had to be their own controllers. They had to look out for other air traffic and alert them to their own presence as they made their way in. All three pilots were carrying out their own duties, while at the same time keeping an eye on each other.
I had to delegate. Peter used his initiative, Ross used his initiative, and we would separate and come together. And this was our CRM, which is pretty amazing for something like this. How can I help? How can I unload the captain? What else can I do to enhance our operation? They're working independently. We come back together. We talk about things. We go back again. It's pretty special to be able to do that.
This was teamwork at its finest. But teamwork alone would not get the plane down safely. At the back of Captain Sullivan's mind, now creeping its way forwards, was the possibility that, low to the ground, the plane would pitch down again. This was the nightmare scenario. On final approach, the plane wouldn't have enough altitude to recover from a dive. Sullivan needed to minimise the chances that this would happen, but if it did happen, he needed to somehow maximise the chances of recovering from it. For that, he was betting on a last resort technique he learned as a fighter pilot, which we'll see in a moment. At this point, Captain Sullivan told his colleagues to pause what they were doing. He was now going to brief them on his plan. It was vital that each pilot was on the same page. As the plane got closer to the airport, their workload would increase exponentially, as would the consequences of another upset. Sullivan's plan was to enter a holding pattern above the airfield, and to gradually descend to an altitude of 10,000 feet. There, the pilots would extend the flaps, just as they would normally do at a much lower altitude for landing. With the flaps extended, Sullivan would check the controllability of the plane, turning it left and right, and ensuring that nothing unexpected happened. If all went well, the pilots would continue their descent, and carry out an approach and landing on runway 36, the northerly runway at Learmonth. The other two pilots agreed that this was a good plan. The seriousness of their situation hit home again, as if it wasn't already clear enough. The ground was their enemy, and yet it was where they had to go. Things were now about to start happening really quickly. Captain Sullivan updated the passengers on his plan, letting them know that he was aware that there were serious injuries on board, and telling them that he intended to land in Learmonth as soon as possible. As the captain made this address, the first officer was flying the plane. He began announcing the flight's intentions to other aircraft over the radio. Without air traffic control to watch them or hear them, the pilots were responsible for maintaining their own separation with other aircraft. The plane was now over Learmonth, and the captain began circling. He kept the runway in view out his left-hand side. Without any electronic maps to help him, this was the only way he could see where the airport was. To the passengers, the runway was a reassuring sight, but still so high above it, they had the terrible sense of being so close and yet so far. Yet that very thing, being so far, was exactly what the pilots needed for the next step in their plan. Captain Sullivan was now about to test how the aircraft flew with the flaps extended. If something were to go wrong, it was much better that this happened at 10,000 feet than at 1,000 feet on final approach. The master caution chime continued to ring. It took incredible concentration for the crew to continue ignoring this alarm, which, throughout their training, they were told to treat with utmost importance. First Officer Lipset continued pressing the emergency cancel button, but it was as useless as ever. Sullivan made the odd joke to his colleagues, trying to keep morale high, but there was no denying the gravity of their situation. While the captain had his hands full with the aircraft, the first officer continued multitasking. He was speaking to maintenance over the satellite phone, he was providing headings and altitudes for the captain to follow, he was broadcasting the plane's location to other aircraft on the frequency, and, at the same time, he was monitoring the aircraft's distance from a ground-based radio beacon to keep track of the plane's position. Seeing how much Lipset had on his plate, the captain decided that it was time to take some of it off. He made the finger across the throat signal to his colleague, signalling that he should end the call with maintenance. They weren't going to be able to fix their problems at this point. All three pilots had to have their full attention on the task now at hand. First Officer Lipset began listing off the inoperative systems to the captain. The list was overwhelming. It would almost have been easier to list the things that were working. And in fact, that's what Captain Sullivan did. He reminded himself that despite all of these inoperative systems, he still had working engines, landing gear, and 3 working pilots. And those pilots would be pushed to their limits on landing. For one thing, they wouldn't be able to use the full flap setting, which meant that their approach speed would be higher than normal. Second, the automatic braking, which applies the wheel brakes automatically on landing, wasn't working either. That was okay, the captain could just apply the brakes manually, but he would have to be careful. His plane was heavy. If he braked too hard on landing, the tyres could deflate or explode. On top of that, some of the spoilers on the wings, which helped the plane slow down on landing, weren't working. All of this meant that the plane would use up a lot more runway than usual. However, thankfully, the runway at Learmonth was long. Barring any nasty surprises, Sullivan should be able to bring the plane to a stop. Just to double check, Second Officer Hales input all of these limitations into the pilot's so-called performance laptop, which would calculate the plane's stopping distance down to the meter. He was able to confirm what the crew had hoped. Even with its faults, the plane had ample room to stop. The first officer ran the calculation on the laptop himself too, just to triple check. And sure enough, the A330 would be able to stop on the runway. But with all of this discussion about landing distances and inoperative systems, the pilots were somewhat getting ahead of themselves. Now approaching 10,000 feet, it was time to see how the plane would behave at lower speeds with the flaps extended, just like the plane would be set up when coming in to land. The captain stopped the plane's descent as he reached 10,000 feet, and asked the first officer to extend the flaps to the first notch. The 3 pilots watched the ECAM anxiously as it signalled the extension of the flaps. Captain Sullivan held his side stick tightly, readying himself for another pitch down. But after a few seconds, all was well. The flaps were now at their first notch, and the plane was flying normally. The pilots breathed a collective sigh of relief. But it wasn't over yet. Lipset moved the flap lever to the second notch. Again, the pilots waited. And again, all appeared normal. The captain then needed to check that the plane could maneuver properly at this speed and flap setting. He turned the plane to the left. And then, back to the right. There were no unusual movements in the side stick, and the plane was handling well. The aircraft was as ready as it would ever be to make its approach into Learmonth. Captain Sullivan asked his colleagues if they were ready too, and they were. Sullivan pushed the nose down and began descending. Meanwhile, Lipset set a target altitude of 3,000 feet on the autopilot panel. The captain would aim to be at this altitude 10 miles from the runway. The tension in the cockpit was increasing as the plane descended. If the aircraft nosed down now, it could spell disaster. Each pilot was scanning the instruments, looking for any sign that the plane was deviating from its flight path. The false stall warnings became even more concerning as the plane neared the ground. However unnerving they had been at altitude, a stall warning close to the ground can easily be a death sentence. The captain kept a close eye on the standby airspeed indicator, while the first officer monitored his airspeed indicator.
It's very disconcerting to be on approach and the stall warning's going off. Is it real? Is it not? Have we missed something? It's like pulling the pin and sit on a hand grenade and sitting on it. And like, do I move? If I move, is that hand grenade going to go off? That uncertainty was huge.
At 27 minutes past 1 that afternoon, Captain Sullivan lined the plane up with runway 36 at Learmonth. They were on a 10-mile final at 3,000 feet. First Officer Lipset made a final broadcast to the other traffic in the area, alerting them that an A330 was now about to land at Learmonth. He then made an announcement to the passengers, telling them that landing was imminent and that they needed to follow the crew's instructions. In the cabin, some passengers were praying and others were crying. They could see out their windows how close to the ground the plane now was. In a few seconds, it would all be over. With the plane now closing in on the runway, the first officer warned the captain that his speed was high. Sullivan acknowledged this, but a high speed was exactly what he wanted and needed. If the plane's computers pushed the nose down now, a high speed would make the control surfaces more responsive. He would need that responsiveness to recover the aircraft. He also had a last resort technique he could draw on from his years of military flying. If the plane entered another dive, rather than trying to pull the nose up with the side stick, which hadn't worked previously, he would turn the plane onto its side and then stomp on the rudder to lift the nose. In other words, he would use the rudder as a kind of makeshift elevator. It was a risky maneuver, untested in a giant aircraft like the A330, but it was the plane's only hope. Sullivan's only hope was that he wouldn't have to use this technique.
That was a last ditch, like, if all else fails, I'm already thinking, this is the only other thing I can do. What else can I do?
Now getting close, the pilots lowered the gear. They watched anxiously as the gear extended and locked into place. They were one step closer to getting there. Lipset then armed the ground spoilers, which would help the plane stop on the runway. The tension was mounting as the plane got closer. The ground was the only place they could be safe, but at the same time, it was the very thing threatening to kill them if the plane pitched down again. The first officer lowered the third notch of flaps, and now the plane was fully configured for landing. The captain readied himself. Adrenaline was coursing through his veins, and he was poised to use all of it if the plane's nose dipped. He made minor corrections to the plane's pitch using the side stick, and to the power using the thrust levers. No words were spoken as the plane crossed the runway threshold. Only the sound of the stall and overspeed warnings filled the cockpit. The rear wheels touched down. Captain Sullivan applied the brakes and lowered the nose. In the back of the aircraft, the passengers erupted into cheers and applause. Flight 72 had landed. The pilots taxied the aircraft back to the apron and shut down the engines. But the ordeal wasn't over yet. This was a remote airfield with only 2 ambulances and a volunteer fire truck coming up to meet the aircraft. Of the 315 people on board, 118 had been injured, many of whom seriously. In the hours that followed, the most badly injured passengers were airlifted to hospitals in Perth. Incredibly, given the sheer violence of the manoeuvres and the extent of many of the injuries, everybody on board had survived. But one question remained. What on earth had caused such a devastating loss of control? The A330 had an excellent safety record, one of the best of any airliner, and it had a whole host of modern systems to improve safety. But, as it turned out, it was exactly this modernness which spelled disaster on Flight 72. An extensive and incredibly detailed investigation into this accident was carried out by the Australian Transportation Safety Board. By forensically examining the aircraft's computers, they found that a glitch inside the CPU of one of the aircraft's computers caused them to generate a host of bad information, which was then fed to the other aircraft systems. These led to the erratic readings on the captain's airspeed indicator and altimeter, as well as the flurry of ECAM warnings. Crucially, one consequence of this bad data was that it led the computers to interpret the aircraft's position as being 50 degrees nose up relative to the airflow. This led the computers to push the nose down in order to save the plane. In reality, of course, the plane was flying straight and level, and the computers ended up pushing it down towards the ocean. Remarkably, the initial cause of this glitch could not be determined. Everything from hardware faults to electromagnetic interference and even cosmic rays was examined by the investigation team. Nonetheless, in the days after the incident, Airbus came up with a procedure for pilots to carry out if they experienced similar warnings to those which had occurred on Flight 72. A number of other crews actually came across this same issue in the following months, and thankfully, each of them was able to carry out this new procedure before they entered a dive. The software in all A330s has since been modified so that this kind of junk data cannot lead to the violent manoeuvres which took place on Qantas 72. These changes have made flying safer in the years since, but the recent crashes of 2 Boeing 737s due to software malfunctions shows that we're not out of the woods yet. With the dawn of a new age of automation on the horizon, thanks to recent developments in artificial intelligence, we have to wonder about how manufacturers like Airbus and Boeing will balance the safety benefits of such technology with the new risks they introduce.
Let's look at the world ahead. Automated vehicles, more automation in airplanes, artificial intelligence. This is our future, which is now. You might think it's easier, but now you're interacting with an exotic system that can fail in an exotic way. Is there a requirement to do it for safety, or is it for market share? I don't know.
If you'd like to watch the rest of my interview with Captain Sullivan, then you can join these people here and join the Patreon, and I've put the link to that just on the bottom of the screen here. Patrons on the channel get lots of perks like this, as well as early access to every video I make, and as well as that, it's a great way to support the channel. Also, if you've watched a few of these videos, you'll know that I don't really do any plugs or anything at the end, but in this case the Captain has actually written a book about his experience, and I've put the link to that in the description as well. It's a fascinating story, it's quite personal and harrowing in parts, but there's loads of detail in it that I just couldn't capture in the 50 or so minutes of this episode here. So definitely check that out if you're interested in finding out more about this story. So I hope you enjoyed this one, and I'll see you soon for the next episode.